My name is Steve Culman. I am here to talk to you today about a topic that we've been very interested in for several years now. Hopefully others might be too. And it revolves around this question of sulfur needs in crop nutrition. There's a lot of interest, a lot of buzz in terms of this this topic, and I'll tell you that although we do have a lot of good information at this point, we're still, we haven't entirely crossed the finish line. And today, I'm going to split the talk that you'll hear in the next hour. We're hoping to go about 45 minutes, plenty of time for questions, but I'm just going to kind of kick things off with a little bit of an introduction about why we're thinking about sulfur and share with you some of results of Onfarm Trials. And then Sakthi is going to take over and talk a little bit about a project that we've been working on collectively over the last few years, thinking about a little bit outside the box in terms of not just soil testing or plant analysis for thinking of sulfur nutrition needs, but maybe there's other approaches we might take. So, okay, well, sulfur, this is a slide that I share with my soil fertility class. And, it's one of the macronutrients, NPK, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Primarily, the major source in terms of plants is organic matter and precipitation, as we'll talk about here in a bit. And in terms of kind of concentration in the plant, what's required, of course, nitrogen, potassium are typically in terms of actual mass or concentration in the plant, those are going to be your biggest elements that are nutrients. Sulfur is on the order of something similar needs with phosphorus and magnesium. And that concludes your background information about sulfur. So let's move on. Okay. So why here? Why now? Why are we all gathered in this room? These are lots of large existential questions we could ask. I'm going to constrain the conversation, hopefully, to talking just about why there's so much buzz, why we are interested in sulfur. So there's likely more reasons than this, but this is what we kind of come up with in terms of some of the justification for looking into this. So we know that there's decreasing sulfur deposition in the atmosphere, and I'll talk about that in a second. We know our crop yields are increasing. Crops are more productive now than ever, and so our nutrient removal rates are going to be matching that. We know that there's been a pretty large reduction in terms of the fertilizers we use, both mineral fertilizers and manure sources that are sulfur-rich. And then there's also fewer sulfur-containing pesticides that are used. And I want to talk a little bit about sulfate deposition, okay? And give you this little graphic. This is from the early 80s to present day, or 2012. Sulfur deposition that's occurring. And you can see the scale here is 0 to 20 kilograms per hectare. That is roughly equivalent to pounds per acre, right? And so let's just look at that one more time. It goes by kind of fast. So in case you were napping, we might want to look at it one last time. So here it goes again. What happened in 1990? Clean Air Act, talking about regulating both nitric and sulfur oxides coming out of the atmosphere, or coming out of primarily coal-fired power plants. That was implemented, essentially became mandatory in 1995. In 2010, there was some general reductions over the next 15 years. In 2010, they basically said, okay, this is the cap in terms of how much sulfur can get released. So we've got these giant scrubbers in power plants, and we pull a lot of that sulfur oxide out of the atmosphere, out of those emissions, and we're just not getting the deposition that we normally did. Okay, so that's a major cause of concern. We haven't historically had to think about fertilization of sulfur in the past, but maybe now it's time, right? And so you can see these numbers again. The units are in metric units, but roughly equivalent. In Ohio, we've got 5 of these monitoring stations. What happens, in case you're interested, we go out on a weekly basis, we measure precip, and actually there's somebody that collects that rainfall and sends it to a central lab. They analyze it for things like sulfate, nitrate, et cetera, et cetera. So we can see in Ohio we're getting something around 6 to 8 pounds of quote-unquote free sulfur fertilizer that falls throughout the course of that year. That's an annual total, okay? We can look at it another way in terms of on a pound per acre basis from the 90s to present day, and we can see, you know, this is data from Worcester, but it's very consistent in terms of what's happening across the country. So suffice it to say that we are getting less sulfur deposited on our croplands over, you know, significantly less, half of it, than we've had the last 20 years. Another issue that we need to think about is our removal rates. So we've just had a large process in terms of conducting a lot of on-farm field trials in the context of revising the Tri-State Fertilizer Recs. We've analyzed a lot of grain in that process. So this is about 4 years plus of grain, and we've kind of looked at what our unit is, what our removal rate. So in other words, for corn grain, it's about 0.04 pounds of sulfur per bushel of corn that we remove. Soybeans quite a bit more, 0.18 bushels. And what does that mean in terms of, if we think about a crop, around, if we're talking about a 200 bushel corn yield, we're removing about 8 pounds of sulfur. This is actually quite a bit lower number than you actually typically see, but this is what we've seen with over the last 4 years. So, you know, a nice round number to think about in terms of a corn-soybean rotation, on the order every couple years we're pulling off about 20 pounds of sulfur per that corn-soybean rotation, okay, so on a per acre basis. Of course, we have more than corn and soybean on the landscape, and there's, you know, we can think about different crops, the potential yield that they might have, and the actual sulfur that's removed in that biomass, whether that be grain or whether that be forage or what have you. But you can see the range is relatively constrained, right? Somewhere between maybe 5 to 30 pounds is what we'd really be taking off on an annual basis. And so we compare this to something like nitrogen or something like potash. Of course, it's an order of magnitude less essentially than what we're dealing with numbers for nitrogen or potassium. Okay, another point is why we might be interested is looking at reduction of sulfur in our fertilizer sources, and this is just fertilizer sale trends, looking at things like DAP, diammonium phosphate, or MAP, monoammonium phosphate, versus this blue line, which is a super single phosphate, of which we can consider triple super in that category, right? So there used to be phosphorus fertilizers that had sulfur in them, and as we know, triple super, single superphosphates are increasingly difficult to find, not being applied to the landscape. And so we just aren't getting that sulfur application. Manure, of course, relevant for this session. Very, very good source of sulfur, very good source of microbes, very good source of a lot of things. There's a lot of sulfur in manure, right? So if you are applying manure on a regular basis to your cropland, I'm going to make the statement that you probably don't need to think about sulfur. It's going to be a very rare case. If you're making regular applications of manure, sulfur fertilization just isn't going to be necessary. And here's some numbers. These are book numbers. I don't know, Glenn or somebody that knows more about manure than me can tell me if these seem still consistent, still accurate. I'm not really sure. So, okay, so I just talked a little bit about why we might be interested in this. So, you know, do we actually need to fertilize? How do we know when we need sulfur? I'm going to point to the Tri-State recommendations in terms of what, some other guidance. Most soils in Indiana, Michigan, Ohio will adequately supply needed sulfur for plant growth. In instances where we actually want to think more seriously about it, these are things like Sandy soils, low in organic matter, acidic soils, cold and dry soils, soils that have a known history of compaction or restricted root growth. These are scenarios where we might want to think a little bit more seriously about fertilizing with sulfur. In the context of visual aids, of course, that's one of our primary first entries in terms of understanding what's going on in the field. Sulfur deficiency, as you might know, resembles nitrogen deficiency quite a bit. They look very similar. Sometimes we'll get some more striping with sulfur. The main difference between sulfur and nitrogen deficiency is that sulfur deficiency occurs on young leaves first, so in that new growth, whereas nitrogen is going to occur primarily in older leaves. Okay, so that's one little tip. Often things can be weather-induced. You know, really cold soils where we're not getting a lot of mineralization, you might see some deficiency symptoms pop up, but then as conditions improve, plants have the capacity to grow right out of that. So what are our tools that we have available in terms of testing for sulfur? How do we know if we need sulfur? Well, this is part of the problem. This is part of why we're here to talk. But we really don't have very good tools right now to assess if we need sulfur or not. That's just the reality. I get calls quite a bit. What's the tri-state recommendation for soil test sulfur? There is none. One doesn't exist. We've never developed a recommendation for that, right? So why is that? Well, there's a number of reasons. One of the reasons is, you know, you could ask the same question. What's the tri-state recommendations for soil nitrate? Do we base our nitrogen recommendations on, say, soil nitrate? Typically not, right? That's not something that we've really endorsed. And it's because sulfur, like nitrogen, is primarily in the organic form. It requires mineralization, that churning of that microbial community to make a plant available. And soil testing is difficult to predict, right? We can't take a soil test, say, in March or in the fall and have a really good, realistic idea of what that sulfur release is going to look like in the spring. So sulfate is like nitrate. It's a negative ion, so it's easily leaches from the soil. So right now, what we say is tissue tests can often be more accurate or a little bit better, more reliable source than a soil test. And it's a fairly unsatisfying answer, but really, if you want to know the answer to that question, do I need sulfur? Strip trials are really the gold standard to figure that out, or at least a test strip to figure out. Do an application, see what happens, right? See if you get any kind of increase in plant growth or a yield bump. These are just published ranges from the tri-states. We're going to be updating these, but probably not a whole lot. We think that these are pretty good numbers still. Might be a little bit of tweaking, but this is looking at tissue testing, at silking for corn, just before flowering or at flowering for soybeans, and then at flag leaf for wheat. So these are the published values that are in the tri-states. We call this a sufficiency range. The idea is that you submit, say, an ear leaf for corn. They measure the concentration of sulfur. If it's in this range, you're good. If it's low, that's bad, and if it's above, then you probably have excessive sulfur. This is, again, just kind of a background slide in terms of looking at the different sources that we have available. Of course, elemental sulfur is always an option, but not always immediately available. Ammonium sulfate, very popular source. Gypsum, calcium sulfate, very popular source. There's also potassium and mag sulfates, and then ammonium thiosulfate. So these are really kind of the tools that we have to help address deficiency, right? Okay. So just in the time remaining, I'm going to talk a little bit about strip trials that we've done. So, and again, we're not quite there in terms of having a really comprehensive view. I'm only going to be showing yield data now just to give you some sense of what we have. I'll start with the work that Laura Lindsay and Grace Bluck did in 13 and 14, 16 total trials. These were on-farm trials at the following counties. They did a large application rate of 2 tons of gypsum per per acre at planting. 16 trials over 2 years, no difference with gypsum. So no actual yield response to that. The R1 trifoliate leaves, in other words, tissue analysis was in recommended range. This is published data, but this is relatively recently, of course, in the last 5 years. We can talk about a little work that I did in terms of OSU farm. This was at our common 3 branches of the western branch in Clark County, up in Worcester, my neck of the woods, Wayne County, and then Wood County at the northwest branch. We went out and we put down a rate of a half a ton of gypsum per acre in 15, and we did the same thing in 16. These little NS's mean not significant, meaning no difference if you run the stats. The light bars are the check, or in other words, the unfertilized. That's the business as usual. And then these darker bars are what received gypsum. We did see a significant yield response in Wood County. These are that's a Hoytville soil, a little bit heavier soil in that first year, but not in the second year. No differences in the other 2 sites. We did this exact same thing in beans. And interestingly, we found, again, that first year in Wood County, a significant increase in yield, in soybean yield, due to gypsum, okay? But no other differences after that. So this is perhaps the most compelling bit of evidence I have for kind of in the same year at the same site we see both corn and soybeans yielding significantly more with gypsum. We ran these trials. We really wanted to push this out in on-farm trials and did quite a bit of work this year. These are 7 different counties that had a 1 ton per application of gypsum versus not. Okay, these are kind of small strip trials. We see some hints in Crawford County. We saw a hint in Fayette County. P-values of, say, 0.12, 0.15, but not what we would kind of consider statistically significant of the gold standard. The other sites, not really any suggestion of any kind of yield response. So, depending on how much you want to rely on statistics or not, we might think that we might, have something going on here, but not really definitive anyways. We also did this in large strip trials across, in 3 counties here, 4 in Fulton, 1 in Miami, and 1 in Auglaize County. Again, this is all the same. It's gypsum versus, well, actually, this is not gypsum. These are, I stand corrected, these are all sulfur, so thiosulfate or, I don't actually recall the details, but I know a number of them were thiosulfate. And nothing in Fulton County, nothing in Miami County, and we have 1 significant difference in Auglaize County, where it's pretty convincing, about a 15 bushel yield bump with a sulfur application. We also conducted 13 trials this summer. This last summer, I suppose. These are on certified organic ground, mostly dairies. In the following counties: Wayne, Holmes, Franklin, Hardin, and Logan counties. 7 in corn, that's both field corn and silage corn, 5 in alfalfa, and 1 in oat. Gypsum was applied again at 1 ton per acre. Nothing. We got nothing out of that. No significant differences. So most of these studies, we see bumps in sulfur in our soil test. We see bumps in our tissue. We just don't see it translate into yield. It's not very common, right? So I don't even have all the data here. Ed Lentz has done quite a bit of work. I don't know if Ed's here, if he wants to say anything about some of the work that he's done, but he's done numerous years in terms of looking at sulfur in both corn and wheat. Again, fairly inconsistent yield responses that he's seen on farm. We've got another 13-odd trials from soybeans with no differences in 2017. 4 years of continuous corn with gypsum at 2 sites at both Wayne and Wood County. Continuous corn for 4 years. Out of those, so 4 years and 2 sites, 1 year Year number 4, interestingly enough, at that same Wood County site, we saw a yield increase and not much else after that. So I don't think that the book is really, you know, the jury's still out a little bit here, but we've got kind of a wide body of data, small strip trials on farm where we can control some of that variability, large strip trials, organic, conventional. We just don't see a huge frequency of crop response. I'm talking primarily grain yield to sulfur application. So I don't know what that means. I mean, I think that means we're not in some kind of panic, dire situation, right? We just don't have a lot of evidence for that, but it doesn't mean that it's not potentially coming down the pipeline. And so just to kind of summarize, sulfur fertilization may benefit you when you've got particularly low organic matter soils, coarse textured soils, poorly drained. If you know you have sulfur deficiency, if you've got a documented history, well then you're probably going to have it in the future, so you might want to think about that. Situations when it's unlikely, fertilization is going to benefit you. Higher organic matter soils, soils that have silt and clay, so especially the clay fraction, when you've got heavier clay soils, you typically have greater organic matter. Now this kind of flies in the face of our Wood County site where we're seeing some responses, but there's some nuance there. Manured fields, typically we're not going to, I mean, I think that most folks would agree we're not going to really see that, right? So just to conclude, and then I'll pass the mic to Sakthi, but we're not seeing widespread deficiencies for sulfur. We've got work to do in terms of soil testing. There's people that are working, trying to essentially come up with a better soil test for sulfur. This is work that dates back 40, 50 years, but there's renewed interest in it now. I know Jim Camerato at Indiana is doing some of this work, as are others. We want to think about tissue testing as kind of a really good way to kind of, as an insight into a management tool to understand if we need it or not. I think that this is still a very valid approach. And again, if you're really ambitious and really wanting to do it, just putting out a strip or leaving, you know, if you are going to apply sulfur, gypsum or AMS or whatever it is, leave a strip out and see what happens, right? I always recommend that. And so we also might want to consider an alternative tool, an alternative approach, and I'm going to ask Sakthi to come up for that. This is my contact information. I'll thank you for your time. We'll take questions at the end if you have questions.
Hi, my name is Sakthi Kumaran Subburayalu. I'm at Central State. Just wanted to talk about another alternative testing tool that we developed out of this project. Steve talked about tissue testing as a potential tool for just assessing sulfur availability in our farms. But we also developed this tool. It's a model-based sulfur availability tool. It uses some parameters, and what we have tried to do is create a map of sulfur availability in the U.S. soils. What we have used is what is called G-Sorgo freely available databases. I think you're familiar with gridded sorgo data. So I've used that data and other freely available data sources at the national scale, and we've processed some factors that determine sulfur availability in our farms, and we've created a sulfur availability index, and we've built a prototype GIS tool. I'm working on that. We're still working on that. We should have that tool out on a Google platform, on a Google Earth basis, kind of like, it's a Google Earth where you could go dig down into your farm to identify sulfur deficiency or sulfur availability in your soils. So this model approach, we took a sulfur balance approach to create this tool. Warren Dick and David Cost and team in Ohio, they worked on this publication, was in 2008, where they took data from about 1,400 soil samples represented in Ohio, representing about 443 soil series in Ohio. So they collected this data. They collected the organic matter information from this data set, and they computed the mineralization of sulfur from this data set using bulk density, and computed a model. So we've used a similar modeling approach to come up with this map at the national scale. So what we've done is, you'll see here, these two are the inputs, which is sulfur mineralized and sulfur deposited from atmosphere. Steve talked about that, and sulfur mineralization from organic matter, and then sulfur leached, which is an output, which is going to take our sulfur down, and sulfur required by crop. It's a simple balance approach. So here's our sulfur mineralization in the U.S. So we took the organic carbon data, organic matter data from Surgo. We also took the bulk density. I summarized it by different horizons. And we used a sulfur carbon mass ratio of 1:60. So every 60 kilogram of carbon, let's say 1 kilogram of sulfur is available then, and we used a standard mineralization rate of 2%, annual mineralization rate of 2%. So we used this formula to compute sulfur mineralization in the entire conterminous U.S. So what you see is a scale. The red area is less than 5 kilogram sulfur per hectare mineralization, and goes up to more than 35 kilograms sulfur per hectare. So this is one of the layers that went into the model. And this is the deposition, sulfur deposition from atmosphere. We used an average, a 3-year average, 2013 through 2015 average of sulfur, both wet and dry sulfur deposition. Averaged this out and computed sulfur deposition in the soils in Ohio, in the U.S. So, so this is the logic behind this model. So we have an net availability index. N index stands for the net availability index here, which we computed in this manner: sulfur mineralized plus sulfur deposited, and we took out sulfur required by crops. We did this for 2 crops, so 2 types of crops, which includes crops that require high amounts of sulfur, high requirement crops like alfalfa, or low requirement crops like corn, soybean. So if we can categorize our crops into any of these 2 categories, we should be able to arrive at some kind of sulfur availability assessment on our farm. So this is the logic that we used, and we added these 2 up and took out the sulfur required by crops, and we came up with this index. So if potential sulfur mineralized minus the crop requirement, these 2 added up and minus this, if it ranges between -15 and -5, then the availability is really low, and the availability increases as we go up or go down this column here. So so that was our input, and the output is leaching. It was another thing that we had to compute, and it's really hard to compute leaching from soils. But we followed a indexing approach. Again, to this we used pH data from Surgo, graded Surgo data, and we also used percent clay information from Surgo data. And I summarized this data for the entire profile. And then we use, for precipitation, we use the PRISM data, 30-year climate normal data available at a resolution of 800 meters square. So we use that, and we use the hydrologic sol group information. And I've created this index based on these values. So we have, so wherever you have higher clay content, then the availability is higher and the leaching is lower. So that's why you see a 1 here, 2 in this manner. So we computed this index for each of these 4 variables and summed it up in this manner. And we created a leaching index for the entire conterminous US. So this is a leaching index map. As you can see here, the leaching index ranges between 1 and 10. So this is a map of leaching in the US. So now we took those two layers and combined them, and we came up with a sulfur availability index for the entire conus. So if the sulfur availability score, which is N index minus L index, that is net availability index minus leaching index, if it ranges between minus 10 and minus 7.5, then we labeled that as a highly deficient. What it means is that a response to sulfur fertilization will almost always occur in those soils. So this logic again comes from that paper that Dr. Dick and team they have developed. So if it's between minus 10 and minus 7.5, then we can see that sulfur response almost always occurs there. And if it is between minus 7.5 and minus 6, then it usually occurs. But if it's minus 1 and 1, it's highly sufficient. So here are our results, that we, after combining all those layers, this is for low requirement crops, this is for high requirement crops. What we can see here, the western part of the United States, it's pretty much green, which is variably deficient. So sulfur response might occur in some places, depending on the specific conditions. If you go back to this thing, variably deficient, so it often occurs depending on specific crop conditions. So that's what we see here in the western part of the United States. And looking at the Midwest here, roughly. For low requirement crop, you can see a lot of green there, which is variably deficient. And then some areas down here, you can see highly deficient soils in sulfur. So, but for high requirement crops like alfalfa, then you can see a lot more moderately deficient. That's brown and red, which is highly deficient soils. Another interesting thing that we should note along the coast here is all, soils that can respond to sulfur fertilization in this area. So this is just a graph of how much of each state is cultivated. I used the cultivated layer from crop data layer, cultivated layer, and averaged it between 2016 and 2017. So the top 5 states: Kansas, Iowa, North Dakota, Texas, and Illinois. So here is our for low requirement crops. What you're seeing is we've summarized the data by state. So I know it's really hard to see these abbreviations here, the states, but so if you look at this graph here, each bar, the height of the bar indicates the total cultivated area in each state here. The state is labeled really small, so I think it's really hard to see. But you can see, like, for example, in this here, Delaware here, red, a lot of red and brown, which is moderately deficient, red, highly deficient. And then you can see Iowa here, Indiana, Illinois, so this region right there. So Georgia, for example, you can see mostly red. Georgia here. And here Minnesota, and in this region. So, this is a good way to look at what is the proportion of different classification, right? Whether it's variably deficient or highly deficient or moderately deficient in different states. And similar graph for high requirement crops. Again, you can see that Delaware and other places, other states like, let me see, it's in Iowa here, which is red, and orange here. So Ohio, if you look at Ohio is right here, which is half of it is red and half of it is brown, which is highly deficient, moderately deficient for high requirement crops. So this is the state's ranking. So just wanted to also show some results from Ohio. So most of it is green. You know, Steve was talking about the different trials that we have in Ohio, and we have not seen good responses to sulfur fertilization. Not surprised, because most of it is variably deficient. It really depends. One of the things that we haven't looked into from our trials is what are some specific soil conditions that we have applied this sulfur. We have summarized it by county, but we really don't know, because you see a lot of, for low requirement crops like corn or soybean, it's mostly variably deficient in Ohio. Some places down south here, you can find much more responses to sulfur fertilization, but up northwest, it's mostly variably deficient. So it's important that we dig into our data set and see where we are seeing those responses, where we are not seeing those responses, or they all, fall under a certain category. So, and this one onto our right here is for high requirement crops, for alfalfa and crops that require more than 30 kilograms sulfur per hectare. And we also summarized it by county. I don't know if you can see this, but Fayette County, when Steve was presenting his results, we can see that in Fayette County it's mostly red and brown, where you can expect some responses to sulfur application. So that's where Steve was saying that he has found some responses there. So Steve and I, we'll have to work and see if we can identify where we're seeing responses. So this is summarized by the county. And here's a graph for. So what we have done is taken this data and working with Ohio State to take this data into a GIS platform. We'll have a Google Earth kind of interface. We'll load this data, and what end users could use, like crop advisors or farmers could do, is just go to their farm field and draw a polygon around their farm field, and it's going to give you a map of sulfur availability. It's a rapid assessment map of sulfur availability in soils. So it will also give you a report about what to do with that data. So we're working on this. We should have this up soon for the entire CONUS. We had this for Ohio, but we wanted to do it for the entire U.S. and we should have this tool pretty soon. I'm thinking that maybe next couple of months we should have this tool available freely for people to use. So this is going to, and I think the way that this tool could be used, one is, it's a rapid assessment tool, and Steve was suggesting that we use some strip trials, to see if we are seeing any sulfur responses. So the question to ask is, where should I try? Should I use strip trials in my farm field? If that's the question that you're trying to answer, then this tool is a good, useful tool to have. You could just dig down to your farm field and see if if there is a potential for sulfur deficiency on your farm. So with that, just thank you, everyone, and Steve and I can take some questions.
Question, yes, sir.
Yes.
Sulfur, how much should you be using?
Question is, if you're using sulfur, how much should you apply? I showed some information about, say if corn and soybean rotation for a relatively productive field, maybe 20 pounds that's removed in that rotation. Is that all the sulfur that a crop takes up? Well, of course not, because we don't do a complete harvest, right? So the crop's going to take up more than, say, 20 pounds or what have you over the course of that rotation. So what we've seen, and to answer your question, what we've seen and other folks in the literature is basically like if you put down 10 pounds and you see a response and you put down 20 pounds, you're going to see a response, but there's typically not any difference between, say, 10 or 20 or 20 or 30. So I would think, to be very conservative, if you apply 20 or 30 pounds of equivalent of sulfur, that would be more than sufficient. So
About 100 pounds of ammonium sulfate?
About 100 pounds of AMS, yes, sir. Yep.
This fall application of ammonium sulfate, is that still allowed full benefit
through the cropping season?
It's a great question. Question is fall application of ammonium sulfate. Does it stick around? Do we see a full benefit? So, of course, with ammonium sulfate, the majority of that is going to be the nitrogen source. With the fall application, we're not going to recommend that because that nitrogen isn't going to. We're not going to count on that nitrogen being there. It might be there depending on the conditions. The sulfur, we would think that some leaching would happen as well. I think probably the best approach to think about would be kind of a starter situation in terms of the application, a small amount, and putting it an available source right up front at planting or a pre-plant application. So, can you do fall application? I think yes. I don't think that. I mean, we're looking into this in terms of just trying to get a little bit better handle on when you do an application, how long does that actually stick around? So we're going back and sampling fields and seeing, that rate of decline of sulfur in that soil. But I wouldn't. My intuition tells me, my experience says that it's still going to be there in that spring, but you will, of course, because it's sulfate and it's a mobile nutrient. You're going to see some loss if you do a fall application. So. Same for corn and soybeans. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Are you doing work with sulfur, with the phosphorus running off, like urea?
Question is, if we done work with sulfur and phosphorus loss? I have not personally done any of that work. A colleague of mine, Warren Dick and Kevin King, have done, and they found with gypsum application some reduction in, I don't know, I can't recall the total numbers. At least in some selected sites, the hydrology was changed with that, so we had better flow through the tile, and then I think Warren, I see you out in the audience. Correct me if I'm wrong. That first year there was no total difference, but in the second year we actually saw a total load difference, less phosphorus coming out.
4 years, the concentration went down, but if you look at concentration times the amount of flow that first year, we opened up the soil, so we actually lost the same amount of sulfur and phosphorus compared to where we didn't quite get to the second year.
Sure. So Warren just said both years the concentration went down. That first year there was actually more water flowing through the soil because the soils were opened up with that gypsum application, but that second year is when we actually saw. This is a good point. It just brings you, really the presentation was really about, we use gypsum as a source, as a sulfur source for a lot of the data that I showed, but there's a number of things going on here that we need to think about a little differently. One is actual sulfur nutrition of the plant, right? And that's really what my presentation or these on-farm strip trials are about, more about hitting it right, fertilizing right at planting and seeing if we see some kind of yield response. And we primarily would attribute that to a sulfur nutrition. There's additional research that we're doing, and again, a lot of interest in this in terms of gypsum as kind of a soil conditioner and a soil amendment. And we do have evidence that it does change soil properties to some extent. How consistent that is, or how long that takes, that's what we're trying to get a little better handle on. So it's a good point to bring up that really this isn't. The thought that saying, oh, well, we're not seeing a lot of responses to gypsum doesn't mean that we can think of gypsum in a couple ways. One as a fertilizer source, but another as a soil conditioner. And so this presentation really isn't addressing that second piece at all. Yes, sir.
Gypsum encapsulate the clay particles?
The question is, does gypsum encapsulate the clay particles? So that's a great question, and we can get down to really nitty-gritty soil science, but we know that calcium, the word is flocculate, so we know that it helps bridge when organic matter is forming. It's binding with, doing mineral interactions with those clay surfaces, primarily clay, and calcium helps with that. So in other words, calcium helps the flocculation or the binding of clays to organic matter, and that helps with the actual overall structure, the tilth of the soil. We call that aggregate stability in soil science, and so that's Warren and Kevin's data showed that just with one application there was increase. These were split fields, right? So these are that part of that edge of field study where we had, I say we, I had nothing to do with it, but it was a field split one half, apply gypsum, and we saw over the field level changes in actual water coming out of tile, more water flowing through that tile after that gypsum application. So we have to conclude that it's because that gypsum, helped influence the hydrology of that soil, what was going on. Yes, sir.
Sure, the lime would do the same thing if you have a situation where you need a lime, though. It's not gypsum itself, it's the calcium that you're adding.
This is a great point. Thank you, sir. The comment was, will lime do the same thing? Is it gypsum that's doing it, or is the calcium in calcium sulfate, right? And we believe it's the calcium, whether that be coming from gypsum or lime. Both, of course, are very inexpensive sources. Gypsum, does gypsum increase pH? As I asked, no, that's a question I ask my soil fertility class. No, gypsum does not increase pH, so we're not going to see a pH effect from that. But with calcium, with lime, we do two things: we add calcium, and we increase the pH. So, depending on your goals, I suppose, pick your product. Other questions? I'll say, in terms of Shakti's model, if you are on the core newsletter, whenever that does get launched, we'll put an article in just to kind of give you a heads up about that, so you can, with the URL. So those details aren't sorted out yet, but we'll try to advertise that as much as we can when the time comes. Yeah. Great. Last takers. All right. Thanks, everybody.